Good evening, everyone. We're reconvened, and this is the special work session of the Burnsville City Council. And this particular item is about our financial management plan review. And I'm going to go to our city manager to tee it up and then send it over to our deputy city manager, CFO, Jenny Rhodey, but I'll let you do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Tonight, we are really kicking off our budget process. However, I guess we technically did that at your annual offsite in January. Tonight, our members of our finance department and our team from Ellers will present the updated financial management plan. This is familiar to you. The past 2 years, we've worked on evolving a 10-year building and evolving a 10-year financial management plan to help inform our budget conversations, and that's the intention of tonight. The plan that you're going to see tonight is going to look familiar in that it follows some of the very same assumptions that we have used over the course of the past 2 budget cycles. Your non-binding resolution from established in the 2023 budget process that balanced our budget to the organizational analysis, the addition of the staffing resources that was adopted in the same year. The plan that you'll see tonight also includes policy decisions that you've made to this point, things like the addition of 9 patrol officers, which happened just through January and February of this year. You will also see that this FMP, this financial management plan, will be the basis for our S&P rating analysis, part of the process that you'll use to make further policy decisions on the future of a police city hall facilities project. So some of the numbers that you saw back in November have been built into this model to allow us this month to talk with S&P. So those discussions have been integrated into the plan. Like I said, the plan's built around the assumptions in your 2023 non-binding resolution for year-over-year property tax levy increases. By way of just community information, all of our budget resources can be found on burnsvillemn.gov/budget, our budget calendar, this financial management plan, and resources from every meeting that we have now through the summer as our departments make budget presentations to you to inform your budget decisions leading up to September 17th, when you will consider and adopt a proposed city and EDA property tax levy and budget. That's what we commonly have referred to as your max tax decision. That's the point where you establish a budget and a levy, a point that you can't go above, but you certainly can bring it down at the point of your December 3rd Truth and Taxation hearing, where you'll make your final 2025 levy and budget decision ahead of the new year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny Rhodey, who likely has either something to correct or add to my comments as we get the conversation going this evening.
Thank you, Greg. Madam Mayor, council members. Well, I think
You'll have to lean in because people can't hear.
I know. Yeah.
And then you'll have to speak loud.
I think Greg did a great job introducing that. Covered, I think, many of the bases. I'm not sure I have much to add, but Alyssa and I have been working with Dan and his team at Ellers over the past month, updating the financial management plan to serve as kind of the kickoff for the budget. And, we started with where we left off last year with the budget and updated, some 2023 estimates. Just a reminder, we still have our annual audit that'll be ongoing over the next month. So while we have a pretty good handle on our estimates, we will still have some final adjustments and changes as we finalize our financial statements over the next 6 weeks. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, welcome back, Dan.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council, and I appreciate both of those opening acts. And more importantly, thank you for spending this time with me tonight on what otherwise is a lovely evening. You could be outside enjoying, so glad we have this time together.
Yeah, you had to drive through that snow from St.
Right.
Paul to come here.
Well, as both the city manager and the CFO mentioned this evening, we're here to talk about the update to the financial management plan, something now an annual event in the city's budget calendar. We've talked a little bit about these in some of the introductory remarks, but really the goals for the work session this evening, really to continue the discussion that began in the 2024 budget process, and of course, as alluded to in the remarks by the city manager, even back in the 23 and 22 budget process. So really an ongoing discussion about strategic needs in the organization and the organizational needs generally. As a reminder, when we review the financial management plan, we are looking for guidance from the city council as part of the process about the property tax levy changes. We're going to talk specifically about franchise fees a little bit because that is one of the bigger moving parts of this FMP. And some of our debt issuance assumptions, which are tied mainly to some of the facilities projects that we'll talk about in a couple of slides. And then really this is the kind of one of the events that begins the 2025 budget development process. So as I've joked with Jenny before, I always, when I finish a budget, I always go back to my office, take out a manila envelope, and then write the next year's budget on it and slide it down. So it never ends. A few things just to remind you what is a financial management plan. I won't dwell on this slide too much because this group has been through this more than a few times, but really we focus on some tax-supported funds. This particular financial management plan is augmented by a couple three enterprise funds in the golf course, the Ames Center, the ice arena. We look at existing debt, we look at all of your capital improvement plans, we look at future debt, we look at the tax base, which we have a couple slides on, we'll talk about in a little bit. We look at some operating costs, and really we're just trying to make sure that all of that when put together is forward-looking and ultimately protects and in many situations enhances the financial position of the organization while all accomplishing the strategic vision of the city council. So basically how we marry the plans that the council has established with the financial position of the organization and making sure that all the resources are as thoughtfully deployed as possible. So for this particular FMP update, we looked at 15 different funds. It's worth noting that we're not going to talk about all 15 this evening. We'll talk about really 12 of them, the starred ones. Forestry, street revolving, and improvement construction, those funds are all functioning as expected, and there's really no highlights or new information to share with the city council from the budget development process. And so really spending our time this evening focusing on those funds that have a few more moving parts and a few more things for the group to think about and talk about. Generally, whenever we do an FMP presentation, we always like to talk about economic assumptions. There are really kind of three things that we talk about when we review a financial position. Of course, there is the short-term needs of the organization, there's the long-term health of the organization, but then there's also the economic conditions in which that organization operates. No city, local government, what have you, operates in a vacuum. So we like to take a look at kind of what's happening around the organization, what we know about the economy for the foreseeable future. And really, we know right now that the economic outlook remains stable for the state of Minnesota. In fact, the state recently released their budget guidance, and basically all of their economic indicators slightly improved over the previous economic forecast. And so this is the phrase that they included in their presentation, which I really like. Growth is expected to persist over the next year. So there are some economic headwinds, but generally folks are of the assumption that growth will continue and that the state's budget surplus is about $3.7 billion. It's always important to keep an eye on that because you at the city level, at local governments, the decisions that are made at the state capitol, especially with respect to the budget, will affect things like your local government aid, other grant sources that you may rely on, other funding sources for your activities. And then there are always things in these economic forecasts that create some uncertainty, certain geopolitical conflicts that I'm sure we're all aware of, shifts in federal fiscal policy, what are, happening in Washington with the budget. Right now, we are running the federal government by continuing resolution at this point in time. And then things that happen with monetary policy as well, interest rates, things of that nature. And then, of course, the legislature is in session, so we're always looking at those negotiations on the state budget and, of course, any tax policies that may impact the revenues that are collected or the things that may happen here at the local level. And even, of course, things outside of the budget particular, because there are things that the legislature can do that may change your operations that then have tails in the budget, some of which were discussed at the end of the last work session. So a few kind of additional metrics to kind of look at here that are kind of just of interest. First, in the blue box, something to keep in mind in terms of kind of economic growth. Right now, as far as the forecast would be concerned, kind of in 2024, we're seeing kind of Q3, Q4, a 1.3, 1.4% growth in GDP and a forecast of overall 2.5% for the entire year. And then looking out into 25, the first year of this projection, kind of 1.8. So again, as we talked about in that previous slide, a little bit of slowing growth, but generally still economic expansion, not quite a recession or anything that would be considered contracting in the economy. And then below as well, when we kind of look at one of the main kind of culprits and concerns in our economic forecast at this point in time, kind of the consumer price index, we do see that right now for 2024, if you look all the way on the right, inflation really for this year kind of pegged to come in at about 3.1%, but then 2025 moving closer to the Fed funds target around 2.4%. Still not at that 2%, but still moving in the right direction. So these are some of the indicators that we use when we put together the factors and assumptions that are baked into the FMP to understand how we should be adjusting revenues and expenditures and really growth in the community, especially with respect to the tax base over time. So those assumptions, other factors, there's quite a laundry list, and this is, of course, not a complete list. We should probably have a little parenthetical after that says selected, but we look at a few things. First, when it comes to fund balance requirements at the general fund, the council does have an adopted policy of 40 to 50% with a goal to be at 45% kind of through the planning window. The capital project funds, we have established an informal requirement of 35% of a 5-year rolling average. That's generally because, I think as the council is aware, capital outlays tend to be, and this is a technical term, they're lumpy. You know, you have some in, you'll have a great amount in one year and less in another year, or you may go through periods of savings and period of spending. So we want to make sure that we're moderating that for our plan. And then enterprise funds, they function a little differently, and we tend to look at 6 months of operating expenditures for those fund balances. We do know in 2024, we're including $3 million of American Rescue Plan Act monies, or ARPA funds, the last year that those funds will be deployed in the budget. So that's something to keep in mind as we inform our projections. And then this is a very important assumption. When we build the FMP, we try to essentially deliver the capital improvement plans as adopted by the council and as recommended by staff. So we don't go in and make changes necessarily to projects. We don't move things around. We don't say, don't do that. What we try to do is figure out a way to fund what it is that the council has said is the goal of the organization as expressed both in your budget and your longer term financial plans. Few other assumptions to keep in mind as we walk through the individual funds. We have, as the city manager mentioned, added full-time equivalents per the recent organizational analysis, and then also the additional FTEs identified in the police staffing study. And this also includes adjustments related to compensation for the city's lead the market compensation strategy. So that's also folded in. And one of the major changes really from the last iteration of the FMP. We have looked at new development, and that growth is built in through some preliminary market value rates we obtained from Dakota County, and we're modeling kind of 2% growth in the tax base year over year. 2.5% increase in revenues, 3.5% increase in expenditures. That is by design. It is a small c conservative model, meaning that the expenditures slightly outpace the revenue growth. That's essentially to avoid any unanticipated budget holes. It's always easier to show up and say, hey, we had a few less expenditures and a little more revenue than doing the exact opposite. That makes it a little more challenging. So there's always a little bit of a gap in these to keep in mind. And perhaps one of the biggest and most eye-catching numbers in the FMP, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, is we have about $222 million of debt. That's primarily driven by the anticipated facilities projects that are included in the plan over the next 10 years. And you may recall from our work session in November, that was about $210 million of capital improvement plan bonds for those 3 facilities that have been identified over the next 10 years. And as the city manager mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, one of the main goals of this FMP this evening is really to put something together that the city can then turn over to S&P Global Ratings. As the council is aware, you've engaged them in their rating evaluation services to get some feedback on your credit rating with regard to your facilities improvement plans. And really, the plan that is kind of reviewed tonight, and of course, following council feedback, is the plan that we will ultimately use and submit to S&P as kind of the latest and greatest plan for them to consider and review, and ultimately provide what they call an indicative credit rating for the community. Like any FMP, there's any number of things that aren't included in the plan, and I think the council is well aware of a number of pending studies from fleet, information technology, and ongoing municipal facilities inventory. There's a park plan update, pavement management plan, and then of course a water treatment master plan. I would note the water treatment master plan doesn't necessarily affect this presentation this evening because we're mainly focused on property tax supported funds and not utility funds, but it is something that could have tails into the general operating budget. But as these studies and the information that they provide become more in focus, we can of course update the FMP accordingly, either throughout the 2025 budget development process or of course next year when the financial management plan is updated and some of this information is available. But quite a bit kind of in queue right now that will impact the financial position of the organization going forward. So as mentioned, at this point in time, the FMP does model in additional 30.0 new staff positions over the next 5 years, 12 and 25 and 12 and 26. And then 1, 2, and 3 in 27, 28, and 29, respectively. It's worth noting that this includes all of the FTEs from the rebalanced organizational analysis, as well as the additional FTEs recommended by the police staffing study. So at this point in time, when we're reviewing the financial position of really the general fund, we are assuming that there are an additional 30 FTEs included in the process. And as you can see right now, about 18 of those FTEs are programmed for public safety, or about 60% of those additional FTEs planned, and then 9 in general government and 3 in public works. So one thing to keep in mind as we look at the general fund itself is that at this point in time, there is a planned drawdown in fund balance. The council may recall that as a part of your 2023 budget, you opted to increase the property tax levy, commit some of those monies to fund balance, and then over time, draw those fund balances down. And that was paired with, as the city manager mentioned, those non-binding commitments to the property tax levy. Now, the impact of that ends up being that the fund balances, as you can see in that green line, end up dipping over time as you essentially spend down the fund balance to bring on those FTEs and absorb additional operating costs in the budget. One thing to keep in mind here, though, is that that green line, the entirety of it, is within the city council's policy of 40 to 50%. So ultimately, the plan adopted by the council a few years ago is working. As you can see where that kind of orange arrow is, that is the low point. That's essentially in 2027, the last year of that non-binding commitment. The fund balance does dip to about 41.7%. But since all good accountants round up, we can call that 42%. Essentially, fund balance. And then what we've done moving forward, having a discussion with the city manager, is we have smoothed out property tax levy increases in the following year. And that's really what you see here. So as you'll note, you'll see the 7.6, 7.1, 7.4, and 7.7 really through 2027, which reflect the non-binding commitment. Since that fund balance number does dip to 42%, what we do is try to get the city back to 45% to be consistent with the council's guidance related to your fund balance policy. So what we've done between 28, 29, and 30 is actually smoothed out those property tax levy increases to get the community back to that 45% fund balance number. And then in subsequent years, adjust the property tax levy essentially to keep the community and the general fund at that 45% number. Now, it is possible that this could be smoothed over a longer period of years, because you may notice, for example, in 2031 and 2032, it does dip to 3.1 and 2.4%. The downside of that additional smoothing is the general fund would have a lower fund balance over those series of years. It would essentially take you longer to climb back to that 45% midpoint that has been set by the council by policy. So what is happening right now essentially is as those non-binding commitments roll off, the levy's been smoothed a little bit to essentially prevent a spike in a single year to get you back to 45%. And then there's a 3-year climb back to that 45%. Of course, we're looking out a number of years, so we'll have to see what happens in a few years with the levy over time, and we can make adjustments accordingly. But generally, as you can see at this point, the community really is in a strong position as far as year-over-year changes in the property tax levy with respect to the financial position of the general fund. The other thing I'll note, and we'll talk about again in a few more slides, is at this point in time, there is no debt levy or property taxes associated with the proposed debt for the facility. So as you see on the second bullet point here, that debt is paid with franchise fees. So those levies, of course, have an impact on the median valued home, and we have additional information from Dakota County for the preliminary values, and that's reflected in the table here. It's possible that they may change. Those preliminary values aren't final yet, so there could be a little tweaking between now and the next time the council reviews the median valued home. But generally, as you can see, based on the current strategy, in 2025, with a levy increase of about 7.6%, we would imagine the increase to be about $20 per year, or $1.66 per month. You may ask yourself, that seems like such a low number, and the reason is that in the last legislative session, the state legislature modified something called the homestead market value exclusion. That exclusion actually increased to reflect the increase in the value of homes over time. When the exclusion was introduced in 2012, 2013, it hasn't been adjusted since that time. So in the previous legislative session, it was adjusted up. So then as a result, in 2025, those impacts affect the taxable market value of the home. More of it is excluded based on the average median valued home, and so the increase ends up being a little less. And then as that exclusion normalizes in the following years, you can see that in 2026, the increase will be about $109, 27, $135, and then in the other years, kind of $89 to $90 on average, which is much closer to what the community has typically seen, I'll say, in the 10 years before the 5 years of the non-binding commitment. So there's a little few moving parts there. The other thing I'll just remind the council about is we do have a 2% assumption built into these numbers in terms of the value of the median home. So part of that increase is also attributable just to the increase in the value of the home over time, not just entirely to the levy. But these numbers are relatively consistent with what the council has seen in previous years, but for that market value exclusion change that wasn't factored in as a part of the FMP at this time last year. So a little bit of a deeper dive into the preliminary payable market values. Because of that exclusion change, you can actually see on this slide in the top where it says residential, there's actually about a 2% increase in decrease in taxable market value for residential properties within the community. That's paired against an overall increase in estimated market value of about 2% on a preliminary basis. The real highlight in this slide, though, as you can see right below that negative change in the residential homesteads, our commercial and industrial properties have actually increased about 5 and 6.5% respectively. The thing to keep in mind is that those commercial properties actually pay a higher class rate, 2%, compared to 1% for residential property. So you essentially get a little more benefit from having those increase faster than the residential property owners as far as how your tax levy is distributed over your tax base. So jumping into the overall capital project needs, right now, over the next 10 years, just about $500 million in improvements planned for the Burnsville community, $455 million. As you can see, most of that is attributed to facilities improvements, about $231 million. Of that 231, about 197 of it, though, is for Police City Hall, Fire Station Number 2, and the maintenance facility. So again, much like we talked about in a previous slide, as you can see here, overwhelmingly the capital investment driven by those facility improvements and the planned improvements to those 3 facilities. And then you'll also note that there are about $14 million in other improvements, and those are really tied to things like forestry, the Ames Center, golf course, ice arena, and cable franchise. So kind of moving fund by fund, the Infrastructure Trust Fund, essentially performing well, doing everything that it has been doing. About 2/3 of the improvements right now for street improvements. There are a smattering of other projects related to county signals and multimodal transportation, retaining walls, but as you can see right now, most of it, as designed by the fund and dictated by ordinance, spent on street improvements. The thing to keep in mind here, though, is that at this point in time, the fund does have a fund balance requirement of about $2 million. And there are a handful of years really in this projection, 25 and 26, and also 2034, where the fund does remain below the fund balance requirement. This is not too worrisome, though, because for two reasons. One, the council may remember that there was a $1 million reduction in the property tax levy in this fund to support those non-binding commitments, and that is being phased back over a series of years. Ultimately coming back in 2027. And so you can see in 2027, as that property tax levy comes back online, those balances do return. And so this was really an intentional drawdown in this fund in order to fund other operations and needs. And then as the money returns, the balances return. So again, the plan really bearing out here as you see it kind of ebb and flow, but then ultimately over the balance of the duration really remain generally above the requirement. The other thing to keep in mind is you do in 2034 about $250,000 below the fund balance requirement. That's not very below, and it is, at this point in time, 10 years away. So it's not necessarily a number that we're concerned about at this point in time. Also, when you look at a lot of these charts, we don't necessarily have projects planned for the last 3, 4, 5 years of the projection. So what we do is we actually take a rolling average of the projects and then we adjust them by inflation over time to at least get an approximation of what we would anticipate the community to spend. So when you're at or near the fund balance requirement at the end of a 10-year period, we generally feel good about the fund. It's something to keep an eye on, but it's not necessarily something to worry about, so to speak.
I'm going to trust you with that statement.
Well, ultimately, Madam Mayor, the fund is in a strong position. It does dip a little bit below, but ultimately, even if we were to look out, say, a couple years from now and see that those amounts below the fund balance requirement in 2034 persisted, the council would still have a number of years to make adjustments in order to make sure that the fund remained above. So even if we were concerned about it.
When we went below, but for the TIF district that we closed out, then we refunded and backfilled the trust fund.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, to Dan's earlier point, we've had quite a bit of conversation about ITF as we do on an annual basis from a staff perspective. If you were to take this chart and put it back 10 years, much like 2021, you would see the blue bars dip below that orange line from time to time. It's not, to Dan's point, it's not a significant concern. We have a plan, particularly in those out years, that shows a healthy fund. And our past pattern would show that these ebbs and flows do happen, and the fund is functioning well and as anticipated. So there certainly isn't a concern, at least from a staff perspective, that there would be any future challenge with the fund. As a matter of fact, it appears to be functioning just the way that it has and the way that we've intended it to function over the course of time.
Yeah. That's great. My concern is how many miles of roads do we have that we have to make sure that we reconstruct, rehabilitate, or, and I don't know that.
Yeah,
And so, but I'll trust you guys. I'm just going to continue to listen because we're going to, I'm not sure how, because it's always about $10 million a year that we have to spend on road reconstruction or rehabilitation.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, and I'm grasping at numbers in my head, which is a dangerous game. I believe it's lower than that, Mayor. I do believe we had a I do believe we had a bit of a higher year this last year, if memory serves, because we had combined a couple of years' activities together. Jenny's looking and generally nodding at me, so I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, because it's always not just above the ground, but below the ground.
I would also say that you're hitting on the exact reason why we've suggested the 6 capital studies that we've suggested to you. One of those is a comprehensive approach to a pavement management plan.
Exactly.
Frankly, unique to Burnsville and unlike many of our market cities, to really not only understand pavement condition, but understanding what we have and what condition it's in, also understand what we need to do about it, and that will dramatically improve our ability to forecast and to plan for this fund and frankly every other fund that we're going to talk through tonight.
Okay.
So I do think that will help in informing both the concern and the plan longer term.
Because we just have an item that came before us, because you always plan, Mark, a year ahead of time, and how many miles you're going to reconstruct or rehabilitate?
Good evening, Mayor. Excuse me, members of the council. So we plan from a programming standpoint about 5 years in advance is where we have rough ideas where we're going to go.
I know that you have
We use our
5 years.
pavement condition index to help drive some of that decision, and then coordinating with some of the horizontal infrastructure below ground. So from a longer term, I'd say it's a longer window than a year in advance, but what you start to see that year out is where we really start to do the design and the public engagement as it becomes, let's just say, more of a reality.
Okay, all right. Go ahead, Dan. I'll just wait
No
when I
problem.
see all of these items come before
Well,
us.
thank you, Madam Mayor, and these are good questions, and it's the virtue of the presentation tonight is to talk about some of the challenges that do exist in some of these funds, but the thing I would add to the conversation before I move on in this slide is really 2 things. One, the assumptions that are built into the model are generally conservative, so it's not uncommon over time to see these fund balances decrease because we're only increasing revenues by 2.5%, we're increasing expenditures by 3.5%.
Yep.
The other thing to keep in mind too is that even though these amounts are going down, when we actually get to 2034, even on an inflated basis, we are assuming that the city is spending around $8 million a year on ITF-related projects.
Yep.
So it's still a significant amount of resources for the community to meet its ongoing needs related to infrastructure, at least the infrastructure supported by this particular trust fund. So moving into facilities, we've already talked about this a little bit, but generally as we look out to 2028, we see about $107 million in projects planned over the next few years. Of course, about $95.5 million of that is for Police City Hall. And the Facilities Capital Project Fund, and we'll talk about this in some individual cases here in a few additional slides, also supports some of the enterprise funds, namely improvements for the Ames Center, the ice arena, and the golf course. And really, as you see right there, there's about $8 million between some of those facilities programmed in this fund at this point in time. So always important to keep in mind that it does help and support various parts of the organization. But at this point in time, between the various facility improvement projects, most of the fund does go to those 3 capital projects. So moving into the fund projection itself, this reflects exactly what the council saw at the November City Council work session when we reviewed the 3 alternatives for the franchise fee study. And so as reflected on the slide, option A, 100% franchise fees. When that happens, I think as you may recall, the fund is required to hold significantly more balances in order to meet its fund balance requirements. Much like the other capital project funds, we do use a 35% rolling average of 5 years, but then because this fund also supports debt service, we assume that the fund has any given time at least 1 year of debt service. So if something happens to the revenue source related to franchise fees, the city does have a meaningful amount of time to pivot in order to figure out how to finance and cash flow those debt service payments. In this circumstance, under option A, if the city were to move forward with all 3 projects, by the end of 2034, there would actually be about $17.5 million of debt service flowing through this fund. And as a result, it also needs to carry those higher balances. Now, something that we've also done as a part of this analysis, both presented here and also to the council in November, is we have assumed that the franchise fees will also keep pace with the other program needs related to the facilities fund. So as I mentioned, things for the Ames Center, golf course, ice arena, parks, other needs within the community. Since we're not necessarily dedicating all of those funds, just those three facilities, we do need to maintain higher balances, recognizing that there are other capital costs. Now, the nice thing is, the way it's modeled right now is at the end of the 10-year planning window, there is about $12 million more in this fund than what would be needed to meet that fund balance requirement. And the main reason for that from a financial planning perspective is just the unknowns related to the facilities projects at this point in time. If moving forward, the council decides to complete improvements to Police City Hall and then eventually Fire Station number 2 and then the maintenance facility thereafter, that cash could then be deployed in any number of ways. You could use it to pay in cash for a particular project, or you could actually reduce or delay increases in the franchise fees and forego even collecting that cash. But given the really high cost of the facilities projects and the need to project over a 10-year period, what we've done is been fairly conservative in how this particular fund has been put together. And the nice thing is, really what happens in the future is the council has maximum flexibility as far as how it would want to move forward with those facilities projects and how it would want to either fiddle with the franchise fees or use cash to support those capital projects moving forward. The one thing I should also mention is that right now we are planning on preparing a more detailed franchise fee study that is planned at this point in time to be presented to the council in May or June, basically late spring, early summer. So we'll certainly be coming back with more information about how to fine-tune those franchise fees and give the council another opportunity to weigh in on what those fees should look like, the future of this fund. Of course, in the planning for the projects themselves, you'll have any number of opportunities to chat about what they look like and whether or not they're moving forward. But the one thing to keep in mind here is that we did have to include something in the fund because ultimately, to get that indicative credit rating from S&P, we had to model the projects and the debt that would be issued if the council decided to move forward. So that's just to make sure that you're getting the maximum amount of information and the most value from that rating evaluation service that was approved by the council a few weeks ago. So moving into equipment and vehicle, between 25 and 28, the next 5 years, about 63% of the equipment costs going to public safety, fire leading the way at $4.3 million, and then police closely behind at $4 million. Streets, 3.1, parks, 1.2, and all the others making up $520,000. As mentioned, like some of the other funds, we do have a placeholder included of about $3.5 million per year in the out years of the plan. So essentially, that's based on your historic averages, what we are assuming that the city would need to spend annually in order to maintain and otherwise expand your fleet. And then we are inflating costs at this point in time at 1% per year. Something to keep in mind with the equipment and vehicle fund, much like other funds, it goes through a period of spending and savings based on the needs and the larger outlays. Something to keep in mind, for example, in public safety in 2025, there's $1.5 million for a mobile command center, and in 2026, $1.4 million for a rescue pumper. So I think, as the council is well aware, some of that public safety equipment can be quite expensive and sometimes have significant lead times. So something to keep in mind as the city reviews and looks at the cash flows for the fund. But primarily in 2025, the drop in fund balance is really a result of that $1.5 million outlay for the mobile command center. And then with the rescue pumper happening the year after, this fund actually does now include some recommended bonding of about $1.6 million in 2026. And that is primarily just to make sure that it remains above the fund balance requirements over the duration of the planning period. It's worth noting that bonding has essentially come in and out of this fund over the last few years as we evaluate costs, the plan changes, costs increase, lead times change, et cetera. So it's possible that in the future there may not be bonding, there may be more bonding. That's something that does kind of go back and forth depending on the process. The one thing to keep in mind as well, though, that will be helpful moving forward is that through the non-binding commitment period, we do have annual increases programmed of 3% in the property tax levy. After that year, we have assumed 6% to respond to the costs of equipment that we are currently seeing programmed in the fund. And that 6% is included in those property tax figures that the council was shown earlier. So we are making adjustments moving forward, hopefully to relieve the need to borrow money for some of that equipment. But ultimately, when some of these, especially fire apparatuses come through, we do see it quite common that cities will issue equipment certificates to pay for them because they are extraordinary in their cost.
Madam Mayor,
Yeah. Dan?
when I think of large capital outlays, I always think of the infrastructure trust fund. In a way, bonding 1.6 million is similar, right? It's spreading the cost over time, much like the infrastructure trust fund does in a way, because we're paying in every year, so we can absorb those street projects, and it isn't a big bump. But is there any examples of what is the model of the infrastructure trust fund used in other areas or for other things other than streets?
Mayor, members of the council, there are communities that do have, and they take on various names, but usually it's something like a community investment fund or a reinvestment fund or a heritage fund. And they...
But it's not specific, like for us, it's for infrastructure.
Mayor, members of the council, sometimes it's specific. It depends on oftentimes where the original funds were derived from to capitalize the fund. But what often happens is those communities will use those monies to accomplish internal borrowing to capital project funds. So what'll end up happening is they essentially issue interfund loans, and then they pay interest to themselves, and that internal fund will essentially revolve.
Yeah.
Rather than paying interest to bondholders in the case of an equipment certificate. And so there are models like that. Depending on the size of the community, you do need some millions in the fund in order to accomplish it. It's not to say that it couldn't happen, but there are communities that do that. I'm aware of one right
And
now
one
that...
time that was discussed, and we didn't like doing that, where you're borrowing from one fund to do a project in the other. We wanted it to be more transparent and clean.
One of the reasons I brought it up is ultimately, to me, the best levy is one that doesn't move up or down that dramatically. And that when we put in tools, financing tools or financial planning tools to set money aside, and I think we do that already in many ways. We're told many times, okay, we've got this thing, we've forecasted we need it in 5 years, we start putting money away for it. But depending on the size of what that is, and it could be a variety of different things, I'm just wondering if there's a mechanism to flatten those out a little bit more. And I'm kind of keying in on a statement you made where you said levies of pretty much 3%, but then elevated to, I can't remember exactly what you said, 5% or 6%, 6%, right? So now we're doubling the levy because we're trying to handle the funding and costs of these things and get our fund balance back up. So now we go from 3, then we're up to 6, then we maybe back down again up. So I'm kind of trying to see what tools that might be available that might be similar to the infrastructure trust fund, where it just sort of flattens that out. So we're planning further out in front to absorb large capital costs where there is very little fluctuation, at least caused by that, on the levy.
Yep, Madam Mayor, members of the council, so there are a few things. One, I would say it's certainly possible, and the conversation this evening is an example of how it's possible, because we are looking out into the future and kind of talking about what is needed and what can happen with the levy over time. One of the reasons for the 6% in this particular model ends up being the non-binding commitment, because we are trying to meet those kind of 7 7s and 7s out through 2027. And so we aren't adjusting the levy up in those earlier years in order to meet those commitments. And then as those commitments roll off, the levy then goes up in order to capitalize the fund, because there is additional movement available on the property tax levy generally. So moving forward, you could try to smooth some of those things out. In this model, it's not possible because we kept the commitments in, so we couldn't pull levy increases forward in order to reduce levy increases in out years. The other thing to keep in mind with this fund as well is that it really, over the last couple of years, has been the benefactor of what I'll kind of characterize as windfalls. First is the one-time public safety aid. So there's about an additional $2.8 million that were in the fund that is kind of helping manage some of the levy changes as well. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the host fee agreement that was adopted by the city council. There is on average about $755,000 that's flowing into this fund over the next 10 years. So there are some other tools and other resources that are kind of being brought to bear to keep the levy down. Which is why it is 6%. If those were not in this model at this point, it would be much higher than 6%.
Sure. Since you brought it up, if I could, Madam Mayor, I want to talk about what you just touched on. I noticed in one of your earlier slides, we had 4.6 million better than expected in revenues and up 1.8 million in savings against expenses, so quite a swing, right? How does that ultimately impact the levy?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, so it'll impact the levy in a few ways. The first is, and just in the most kind of ordinary kind of mechanics of the budget, what will end up happening is anything that is kind of a surplus to the budget would, as we say, fall to fund balance. So that money would essentially enter reserves, and then it would be available for other uses. So at this point in time, the city council has the policy of basically saying anything above 45% is available for one-time appropriation. The way the model assumes those types of windfalls is it adjusts the levy in order to keep the city in the general fund sense at the 45% fund balance requirement. So if that fund balance increases, then presumably in the following year, at least in the model, the levy would not have to go up as much in order to absorb the various costs associated with essentially running the city. And in the general fund sense, primarily personnel costs, 75%. So really paying for wage increases, leading the marketplace strategy that the city has, and the employee benefits as well. Now, the other thing that's not about the mechanics of the budget or the model is the strategic vision and priorities of the city council. So ultimately, those monies could be available and you could use them for projects, or you can adjust the levy accordingly to meet whatever your strategic vision is at the time. So that's another way of saying that sometimes it functions totally independently of what happens with the fund balance.
Just one final, was that 4.6 million a structural? In other words, it was revenues that were coming in beyond what our expectations were as a result of something that was structurally going to continue, or was it more one-time money because of, let's just for an easy example, a bunch of development happened. So that we didn't maybe budget for, right? So we got this boom in revenue, but it's not a structural thing, right? It's one-time money as a result of a one-time boom. We don't see that sustaining versus something else, another revenue stream that may be contributing higher revenues this year and the last year, and maybe and is there an actual structural trend to that where that's going to continue to come in?
Madam Mayor, members of council, I'd have to defer to Jenny or Alyssa for that.
Yeah, I think a large part of that increase I would consider one time, in that we had a pretty healthy gain in our market value of investments, so that was about between 1.5, 1.6 million, so that alone
Did we
was.
win back everything we had lost previously?
No, but we won back a third of it. So
Wow,
that's
only a
good.
third?
Yep. Well, over time, as we hold investments to maturity, that will all come back. We won't expect to actually realize those
Right.
losses, and those we expect as rates, and also as rates decline, that number will normalize back to closer
Right.
to our book value of our investments. And we also had a large increase in investment revenue, right? Interest earnings and things with rates being higher. While we don't expect rates right now to go back down to those epically low rates, we do expect those to moderate a little bit, so we don't necessarily expect to be at 5.5%, 6%. We're probably going to be more at 4, 4.5, or even 3.5. So in future years. So
We
and
hope
we're-
for the rest of the benefit of the economy, that happens, right?
yeah, that could help us in other ways.
Yes,
Yes.
lower borrowing costs.
Yep. So so a large percentage of it is probably not going to continue. Again, we do have probably some adjustments that may bring that overall number down as we finalize our audit. We have, a few things left to include, so we do still expect to be, in a healthy position over budget in terms of revenues. And we had increases in various areas. We had about $500,000 in intergovernmental revenue that was an increase over budgeted amounts. Across various programs, not necessarily one specifically. We had, generally, revenues were better than budget across most areas, so kind of just more of more small increases across most revenues, as opposed to maybe other larger areas, but really that investment area was probably where we, if you look at that, that's probably at least half of that increase.
Half of the 4.6 came from just that one.
Yep.
Since you're extremely in tune with these numbers, can I ask you the other half of that equation? The 1.8 reduction in expenses.
Expenditures.
Where did we save that much? Because I guess that was a surprise to me to see that number, because we had a lot of things that were,
Yep.
it seemed to be causing more expense
Yep.
as opposed to saving. Was it this winter salt not being so big? a
I'm
deal?
sure that helped.
Yeah.
And lack of
I
plowing.
I
I'm sure that
remember
helped.
asking Mark, hey,
It
Mark.
probably helped in our overtime, numbers too, as well. And given that we did add a fair number of positions, we didn't add them all at January 1st, so we had a little
yeah.
benefit of some open positions over time. And I think departments generally, in terms of their current expenditures, because we're right now, we had savings in both areas. Those departments are very diligent about really trying to stay within their budgets too, so.
Tightly run fiscally.
So you see savings across many departments,
Sure.
not necessarily large savings, but small savings.
And 2 million is historically, because we've talked about this every budget cycle, 2 million under budget at the end of the year or in a given period of time, generally a year, is not unusual for the city. Historically, that is probably the average if you go back 10, 15, 20 years. There's some years that are 4, there's some years that are $500,000, they're very small,
Yep.
but a lot of years are in that 2 million. For whatever the reason, there's always generally a savings against what the budget was. And that's where it rolls into that unspent allocation. But I remember seeing a chart some years ago that went back about 10 years, because I'd asked for staff to do it, and I noticed 2 was about an average. And so it was, I think my comment might have been at the time, and I'm sure Councilmember Gustafson and the mayor remembers this, is if we're going to have always underspending by 2 million, are we really kind of predicting that? Is that a self-fulfilling prophecy? And could we adjust our budget? Right? But I know nobody has a crystal ball, right? You have to make your best judgment, and then you work at trying to save throughout the year.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've had unprecedented inflation over,
Yeah.
So, you always like to have a little bit of room, so you make sure you can
Sure.
you can remain within those budgets. But 1.8 million, I think, is about 4%, right? So we are in that kind of 2 to 4% range.
Yep.
Again, we may have a few changes before the final financial statements are issued, so I would say, I would expect that we're in that 2 to 4% range.
Right. Well, it's good, and the inflation was probably the piece that would have eaten away when I referred earlier about a lot of expenses. When I heard we had 40% over 2 years in construction inflation, I figured, Mark would have a heart attack and he wouldn't have the ability to do all the road repairs that we need because the costs were just going through the roof with all the bidding. But to come out of a year like that, although it wasn't 40% 1 year, it was 40% over a 2 year period, but to come out of 2023, still saving money, because inflation was still kind of, the tails of that high inflation were still evident, is really good, I think.
Yeah. And we had some, and I think Greg has mentioned, we had some tough budget conversations, which, when we talked about 2024, really kind of, really working to get that budget in place. And departments also probably, they take that to heart when they have the ability to save in 2023 too, because we knew we were up against some pretty large inflationary pressures, and we wanted to, we really wanted to.
Agreed. Well, congratulations to the staff, because it wasn't easy. It would have been expected maybe, and not a surprise, if we'd have been really close to budget and expenses, right? Not saving anything. The fact that we were still able to save an amount that's similar to what has been saved in the past with all the variables going on last year is a credit to the staff.
Madam Mayor.
Okay. No, go ahead. I was just going to go back to Dan to finish his.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Keeley, thanks for that recognition. That conversation is on top of the reality that to balance and to effectively use the community's resources, coming into last year's budget, we essentially the leadership team eliminated an additional $1 million of expenditures last year, if you'll recall, out of the budget. Jenny references my tough budget conversations with the leadership team. I probably get some head nods around the table on this. We've been very intentional about being prudent and wise in our expenditures. And I do think, to Jenny's point, to Dan's earlier point, that each director around the table has been very wise and extraordinarily prudent in expenditures over the course of particularly the last 2 years. And I'm always going to, as informed by the good advice of Jenny and Alyssa, I'm always going to wait for the final audited budget numbers as we look at budget to actual. But that is our intention moving forward. If you look at a 10-year period of time as an example to budget to actuals, $2 million 10 years ago was a lot different than $2 million today.
Today, yeah.
And it's very important for us, particularly in the inflationary environment that we find ourselves in, to me, for each of us to be responsible, particularly on the expenditure side, when the vast majority of what funds our expenditure side of the budget is the property tax commitment and investment the community's making in the services that we're providing. So that credit really goes around the table to department directors who have been very intentional about our expenditures, particularly over the course of the past 2 years.
I think it should be restated, just for the record, because I don't know that there's a lot of time spent on talking about what you just stated with regard to being very deliberate of cutting $1 million of expenses out of our budget. That helped obviously get us to the 1.8 that we ended the year, but that isn't easy.
No,
I mean,
it was hard last year, if you all remember, and I remember saying to Greg, wow, that was, to find that 1.6.
Yeah, and it's also important to recognize, and I don't have the percentages in my mind, so I won't use them, but a significant component of our expenditures, our total expenditures across the organization, are police and fire. Not a dollar of that $1 million came out of either the police or fire operations.
Good.
I think that also underscores the importance of the prudent financial and fiscal management that each of our directors, particularly on the city hall side of the operation, have been doing in order to ensure that we carry out the council's strategic priorities. And essentially, from my perspective, not essentially, from my perspective, one of the most important services we provide in terms of safety to the community. So those priorities are front of mind as we work as a team to figure out how we're going to manage not only the revenue side, but in this case, in particular, the expenditure side of the organization.
Okay. All right, back to you, Dan.
All right, thank you so much, Madam Mayor. So moving into parks, there have been some changes here. So park dedication has been moved to a new park investment fund. So now you have a park renovation and a park investment fund, and I'll talk about what each of those are in just a second here. But for park renovations, $9.8 million in capital costs kind of planned over the next 5 years. About $4.4 million of that is really just to replace and improve bituminous and concrete surfaces in the community. So, and about $670,000 currently planned for the Oak Leaf West Park in 2025. We do have placeholders like the other capital project funds, about $1.5 million in those out years, and those are inflated at about 3% per year. So for park renovation, over the next 10 years, you can see the property tax levy, a 3% annual increase, so consistent with what we've seen through the non-binding commitment window, and then carrying that through all the way out to 2034. It's worth noting that this park renovation fund, these are the monies that can really be used for any capital project related to parks within the community. The park dedication, or excuse me, park investment fund, that one has some restrictions, which I'll talk about in a second. But as you can see, basically in 2033, that park dedication balance gets moved to a separate fund, and then all that's left in this fund is park renovation. There is no bonding at this point planned for this fund, but it's worth noting that there is an ongoing parks plan, so we would imagine that this park renovation fund would change as that park plan is updated and some more information is provided to the council about needs within the park system. The other thing to keep in mind is that the park renovation fund also, much like the equipment and vehicle fund, receives about $755,000 on average per year from the host fee agreement. So that is flowing into this fund as well, and is also helping keep those balances a little higher and support those activities moving forward. Now, the new fund for 2024 is park investment. These are park dedication fees only, and just as a reminder, park dedication fees are cash received by the community for the acquisition and development or improvement of parks, and they can only be used for capital outlays, and they cannot be used for any ongoing operations or maintenance. The reason for the new fund is really twofold. One, it's quite common that communities have separate park investment or dedication funds in order to track these statutorily restricted park dedication fees. So it's a much easier way to track and meet your compliance obligations, but then also from a council perspective, it's a much easier and more transparent way to understand the amount of money that's available in each of the really respective park buckets. You may recall in previous budget conversations and FMPs, we would have this chart that would show the different amounts and the different balances, and it can be a little tricky sometimes to track all the ins and outs and what projects are going to what funding source and how all of that is impacted over time. This new dual fund structure really does provide a lot more transparency and a lot easier tracking for those monies. As you can see right now, park improvements planned about $170,000, some tech and security improvements at $388,000, and then trail systems, the largest cost at $412,000. Most of that, if I recall correctly, is for the cost share for the Lake Marion Trail Gap moving forward. So a good use of these funds. We do have placeholders of about $200,000 per year. We'll have to see how kind of that shakes out as the fund progresses and we get more information about how it functions. And right now, all costs are currently inflated at about 3%. So as you can see in 2023, no money's in the fund because it didn't exist at the time. And now in 2024, the brand new park investment funds and the balances moving forward. It's worth noting that at this point in time, we are assuming about $100,000 in park dedication fees flowing into the fund annually, but that may change depending on development that occurs in the community really over time. Really, there are no other funding sources for this fund other than investment income. And because there's a relatively small amount of capital outlay program for it, it does remain relatively stable over time. We'll have to see what ends up happening with the fund itself, but right now, programming that about $200,000 annually in those out years, and then about $150,000 in revenue approximately annually. It only gets drawn down a little bit year over year. So
Dan?
Not necessarily a question for you, Dan, but for Greg. What's the status of the waste management park dedication fees of 1.9 million, and when are we going to be ready with the comprehensive parks inventory, facilities, capital assets study, so we can make decisions on what we're going to do with that and other monies?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, to Councilmember Keeley's pointer to his question, we are actively working on our parks plan. I would say that in terms of the capital studies, it is one of the plans that is probably the furthest along. And in my more recent communication to you, just as a matter of staff bandwidth and our ability to manage our current reality, we've been delayed in delivering those studies, just from a pure staff time and resource perspective. So I would anticipate the staff's actually meeting, I believe it's in the next week or this week, to talk about formalizing our plan to get those studies back in front of you over what I still anticipate to be an 18-month period of time, starting this year and working through next year. Right now, well, I don't want to make any commitments ahead of our Parks and Rec Director, who isn't here tonight. I do think that the Parks Plan will likely be one of the first that's presented to you. That being said, the council's been very patient with us. I appreciate that. And it is absolutely the council's prerogative not to wait if there are projects that you'd like to see us move forward with. Right now, generally, the agreement that we've had is that we would wait for that study to be presented. I do expect there to be dynamic opportunities for both the park renovation and the park investment fund coming out of that study. We're going to have far more needs than we currently have budgeted for from a capital perspective. And certainly the council's prerogative to put any projects back in, additional projects into the hopper in the plan, so
I'd
to
like
speak.
to make sure that we really do this right. And so I'd like to see the plan before any decisions are made, because there's a lot of need. I mean, and I've seen that firsthand. And in Hugo's and my travels through
Parks tour.
every park, there's a lot of need. So I'd like to see the plan first before we make it. We need to see the plan before we make good decisions on this particular item.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I wish I had a more specific answer to you on exact timing. I think I'll have it by Thursday, informed by the team. Appreciate your patience, and I also would understand if the council wanted to go in a different direction or prioritize something.
I mean, I knew it was getting close, didn't know how close, but given the last month or so, perfectly understandable. As things sort of get back to semi-normal, getting at least a timeline on that parks would be great. We had, the council is all aware, we put off a pickleball court capital investment in favor of, let's get the whole comprehensive plan. And that was a long time ago, but, so I'm hoping it's coming soon. I'm glad, as you said, it's near the end, and you'll have some good information soon.
Yeah. Mayor, Councilmember Keeley, you'll see something by the end of this week in terms of specific timing. So I'll get that to you by the end of the week. I'll also add that, yes, the Alamagnet pickleball project is the one that I did ask you all to pause as we did this work. Hugo and his team in community operations between Public Works and Parks and Rec have that project ready. So we'll have a short, or at least a reasonable turnaround time should the council wish to move that project forward, because I know that it's been, well, since December of 2022,
No, Kelleher Park has
Whatever.
been on the books for a long
And
time,
there are
much
others.
more than, than the Alamagnet pickleball. We can't, just because there are a lot of loud voices about pickleball, that the communities that are underserved communities get left behind. I do not want to see that happen, and I will fight for them.
So we're gonna have Picklepalooza pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Greg, as I understand it, this parks plan is incredibly detailed down to like individual pads of concrete, correct? I mean, this is an
That is
incredibly detailed plan, so it's taking some time because of
Yep.
the level of detail that's involved with it, correct?
Yeah.
That is correct. So it
And the
is,
cost that goes with all of that.
Madam Mayor,
Mayor
members of the
Hugo
council.
took selfies at each one of those and said, yes, this needs to be done.
Pointed to each little thing.
It was a bit more detailed than that, but yes. Madam Mayor, members of the council, Vince, to your question, yes, literally down to backstops, pads of concrete, benches. Our intention was to inventory everything that we have.
Yep.
So we can do a condition assessment. We know what condition it's in to help you inform
Yeah.
how we not only maintain it, but then also, as the council discussed now over a year ago, we identified a gap in terms of community engagement and feedback in our parks plan, where we really needed to make sure, Mayor, back to your comment about best meeting the needs of the community, what is it comprehensively that the community is saying that they want and need in their park system? So all of that has been brought together in an incredibly detailed way that then will help to inform these capital conversations as we go through this budget process, and frankly, I would expect it to be future budget processes as well.
And if I may ask a follow-up, and this might be a question that it needs to be asked when the plan is presented, but I would hope that a lot of the costs associated with some of these repairs can be handled administratively, that council's not gonna be reviewing every
No,
small detail, but for the large ticket
yeah,
items.
yeah, you're right. We usually stay at the policy level but we'll
to
see it, yeah.
Slides and swings.
Yeah. We're not going to be counting pencils.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, certainly will keep that focus on the balance of our roles and responsibilities. I also want to ensure that you have access to all of that information, and frankly, that the community has access to all of that information.
Exactly.
I feel that I am,
Yep.
that we are as a team responsible to make sure that we're good stewards and taking care of everything that the community has invested in.
Yep.
And be that a pad of concrete or a post with a sign on it, all of that costs money, not only to install, but to maintain, and for our staff to run our operations. So having that in one place will, I think, help inform the significance and the magnitude of the investments that the community has made, and the council may, by a matter of your policy decision, identify as an outcome for the future.
And our parks are very important to our residents
Very-
and also to our businesses.
We have a lot of them.
Back to you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor. Moving on to IT. So there is significant movement in the IT Capital Projects Fund, primarily driven by about a $2.3 million outlay for a new enterprise resource planning system. As the council may be aware, a few years ago, our friends at New World, which provides the enterprise resource planning system, the financial management software for the city, basically said that they were no longer recruiting new clients to the software, which in the software world means that they are essentially moving on and likely will not be supporting the system moving forward. Although they have said they won't kick anyone off, they did essentially, I think, sound a starting gun that it was time to start looking at kind of other opportunities. And so that ultimately created a project which has now increased a little in cost as the city has explored what it would cost in order to implement a new system. But this is essentially what would be the financial system for the entire community. So everything from HR to the general ledger, even utility billing, depending on the type and structure of the system. So
Did you say the name of that software was? That's being,
New World.
New World.
not
So
really new anymore, is it?
Not so new anymore.
$2.3 million in total is currently planned. That's based on estimates from similar-sized communities that have gone through similar projects in recent years. At this point in time, the project would be paid primarily with reserves and transfers in from other funds, namely the general fund, then the water and sanitary sewer fund, and the stormwater fund as well. So at this point in time, we are planning as a part of this fund construction to not issue any debt to acquire the software, which is possible. You could issue equipment certificates in order to pay for the cost of debt, the cost of the software. As a result, though, the fund does dip, and it does remain for several years below its fund balance requirement. That fund balance requirement is a little artificially high because we do have that $2.3 million project in the 5-year rolling average. So the gap there is, I think, to be taken with a little bit of grain of salt, knowing how large that individual outlay is for that software project. But right now, really over the 10-year period, about $14 million in capital projects related to IT. Right now, they are all property tax supported, $495,000 in 2024. The council may recall, as a part of the property tax strategy for this particular fund, there were a couple of 20% increases, and now there are a handful of 12% increases, really responding to the ever-increasing demand for IT and IT infrastructure. And as all of these technologies become more ubiquitous, the fund really does have to respond from a revenue perspective in order to meet the demands of the organization and the expectations for the community. Because of that, in the out years, 29 to 34, we are also modeling still a 6% annual increase. And that's really designed, as you see in those out years, to try to get those fund balance numbers really back above those fund balance requirements to make sure that the city really does have enough financial resources in order to support its IT needs over time. The other thing to keep in mind of this particular fund is that generally credit rating agencies are okay if you spend down significant balances. They just want to make sure that you have a plan to kind of build them back, that you're not just driving the funds into the ground, or even in some situations, as we see in other communities, into negative amounts and all of the fun things that get to happen when that occurs. So it's a little bit jarring kind of to look at on a chart itself, but ultimately the city has the money in order to accomplish what really is an essential project for the operations of the city. And there, I think, is a good plan in place to make sure that the fund does rebuild a significant amount of capital over time. But it is really just one of the more kind of challenging funds, and one of the things that ended up having to happen in order to make sure that the fund kind of got back above that fund balance requirement over the 10-year period is it does now include a regular transfer from the stormwater utility into the IT fund of about $25,000 per year, which has been adjusted for inflation. That does help the fund net about $300,000 over the 10-year period. So that is another way, essentially, not to rely entirely on property taxes in order to support IT infrastructure. But there's also a recognition of the fact that the folks that pay the stormwater utility users do benefit from having these systems and having staff have latest and greatest technology, because they ultimately administer the stormwater utility. So the stormwater utility pays for a portion of those costs.
Dan, could you clarify what all IT capital is involved in that fund? Is that servicing every single department in the city, or does it exclude any departments?
Mayor's Council, it does not really exclude
It's inclusive.
any.
I mean, is there a
Departments?
department that relies on technology that's not supported by this fund, but by their own department fund or some other fund?
Mayor, members of the council, no, I wouldn't think so. I'm looking at Tom right now. The only thing I could think of would be like a SCADA system that may be.
The water utility specific funded items are identified through the IT budget, but identified as a funded source through our water utility. But this does represent capital for all departments.
Including public safety?
Including public safety.
Of course, of course.
Yeah,
It
ma'am.
looks like it's woefully underfunded, not just because of that fund balance drawdown, but it strikes me as not enough to keep up with the technology demands and needs that our city would have. And maybe even because public safety is such a big part of what we do, maybe that's more of my sensitivity area. But
Well,
Madam Mayor,
Go ahead.
council members, as we go forward with our IT capital plan study, that will help us identify the necessary amounts of future capital that we may need to accommodate all those items within the entire organization. So we could see this change as a result of that plan going forward.
When's the
as
last time we
become
did a
informed.
plan like that for your department?
I'm sorry, what?
When's the last time we did a comprehensive capital plan for IT?
We did a similar type of plan when we transitioned to a 5-year budgeting cycle during, if you remember,
Yeah.
Tammy Amdahl,
Yeah, yeah.
our former CFO.
Yeah.
It was in those days that we did our first initial capital plan of significance like this.
But I agree with you that it's underfunded, and here's how I know. Just going out there to the parks and looking at all of them, so you have some posts that we're supposed to have Wi-Fi and also cameras, and they're just posts and nothing on it. So, right, Hugo?
That's correct.
So, seen that out there, have posts, so what are these supposed to be? Well, should have some Wi-Fi and also cameras. 0.
Are PD and fire on their own infrastructure though, right? I mean, are we servicing their IT or is that all
yeah.
sourced out through their?
We provide all
We
IT
all-
services for all the departments, including police and
Yeah.
fire.
So even like the Axios equipment, we're servicing that stuff too?
The body camera
Yeah.
equipment, we are providing the core connectivity infrastructure for that equipment.
But software,
But it's a subscription service through the vendor that we help manage.
but our internal software is proprietary to Burnsville for both fire and police? Or is it like a police-driven?
We have on-premise equipment for police and fire, and we have cloud-hosted equipment and services for police and fire
So
services.
we
that-
don't outsource any of that to third?
We leverage several vendor contracts and services through either Logis or other services like an Axon provider. So it's a combination, or what I would call a hybrid approach to providing technology services. Overall, it's centrally organized and managed through our IT department in conjunction with the department leaders. And we do leverage a lot of vendor support and a lot of vendor contracts. But again, typically it's under our management and control and oversight.
So we're studying it, learning it, and then servicing it with the assistance when needed of the vendor.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, back to you, Dan.
So, Madam Mayor, member of the council, to that point, if you wanted to leverage more resources in this area, the primary funding source for the IT Capital Projects Fund is property taxes, so it would require an increase in property taxes beyond the 6% and 12% that are seen here. Otherwise, of course, as mentioned before, you could issue an equipment certificate for the ERP system, which would then preserve capital for other activities, essentially borrow the money. So certainly an alternative there as far as keeping more resources available on hand, but naturally issuing debt has its own costs associated with it, primarily interest expense, so the cost would increase. But those are generally the two options you would have available
I
if
have a
you.
feeling after your comprehensive study, we'll be making a decision on that.
Okay, moving into the cable franchise fee fund.
Yeah. Well, I expected that.
Well, this one looks a little different. That line that you see is not necessarily a minimum fund balance requirement. It's actually the transfers out of the fund and then in the future into the fund. So as you may recall, that really over time, because of the cable cutting phenomena, the franchise fees that have been paid to this fund have decreased. And really the model at this point in time is modeling about an annual decrease of about 4.25%. And the city, recognizing this trend a few years ago, actually reallocated a significant amount of the personnel costs supported by this fund to the general fund, approximately
Yeah.
$500,000. And that even at this point in time, was a transfer out to basically recognize some of those costs were supported by the general fund to the general fund from this fund. As these revenues wane, that transfer, which right now is about $265,000 in 2025, will decrease until about 2030. And then as of 2031, it actually becomes a transfer in. So then in order to maintain stable fund balances over the long term, the general fund actually has to start transferring money back to the cable franchise fee fund. And by 2034, it's actually transferring in about $165,000 a year. So this fund is challenged. It's challenged really by the phenomenon related to the revenues that support it. It is, for lack of a better word, fine for the next few years, but really there will have to be some adjustments made in order to accommodate the funding source for the activity supported by the fund. Otherwise, we would imagine that as the revenues go down, those transfers in would just increase and you'd be pulling more and more money from the general fund. Really, at that point in time, it would just make sense then to reallocate those costs to the general fund and then no longer perform the transfer. So
We've been talking about this for a long time because cable fees continue to be depleting. Not too many people are on cable.
When do we sunset this then?
Huh?
When would we sunset this? I mean, would it have to reach the point where nobody had cable or that specific fund was?
We still have a,
Yep. Madam Mayor, members of
Yeah.
the council, so you would never sunset it per se, the
Never.
fund would never go away,
Yeah.
because you hold telecommunication franchises that you require them to pay a 5% of their gross revenues to the fund.
Yeah.
It likely would end up happening is most of the activities supported by the fund would then be supported by the general fund, assuming the council still wanted to continue performing those services for the community.
Yeah.
And you would still have the fund, it just wouldn't have as much resources in
Yeah.
them.
and we have an agreement.
Kind of like that obligatory savings account you have to open to get your checking account. Just kind of sits there.
Members of the council say, I suppose one way of looking at it, yeah.
All right, thank you.
As long as Comcast is in this city, we collect a fee.
The Ice Arena Fund, so like we've talked about in the past, this one is doing relatively well. Currently, the operating revenues are covering the operating costs. That is noteworthy because we do not always see that with ice arenas, so it's something to be celebrated and mentioned this evening. We are still recommending annual increases in the fees of about 3% annually, and that's primarily to support, of course, the cost of operating the services, the capital related to the fund, and then to protect its financial position generally. But much like some of these enterprise funds related to performing arts and recreation, this fund, while it does have about $750,000 in capital projects programmed directly to the fund, it excludes about $2.25 million in capital outlays that are made by the facilities fund to support the ice arena. So at this point in time, while it is kind of operating at a surplus, it is not generating enough revenue to actually support all of its operations, capital, and deferred maintenance. Those costs, as to the tune of $2.25 million over the next 10 years, are being supported by another fund. So certainly a great thing that it's supporting its own operations with its own operating revenues, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that it does still rely on other funding sources really to maintain the operation. Moving into the Ames Center, at this point in time, the operating revenues do not cover the operating costs. This model assumes an annual increase of 5% in fees, and as you can see, they continue to decline really until 2033. They only rebound slightly in 2034. That's when we really see the upward swing. There's a few reasons for this. The first, of course, as the council is aware, the naming rights will decrease from about $165,000 to $50,000 in 2029. And in 2021, transfers into the fund from other funds totaled about $1 million from the general fund and then also from host fees. And those are no longer dedicated to the Ames Center Fund. So they don't enjoy those additional monies. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that there are about $2.5 million in capital projects supported by this fund, but much like the Ice Arena Fund, there's another $3.5 million that's programmed in the facilities capital project fund to support capital needs at the Ames Center. Beyond that, the property tax levy also supports the current outstanding debt service for the Ames Center, which if you look at the next 3 years of payments totals about $4.9 million. So between capital and the debt service over the next handful of years, there will be about $8.4 million supported by other funds, and the property tax levy generally to for the Ames Center. So really, ultimately, the city may need to identify, and likely need to identify, additional funding sources over the next 10 years, or consider operational changes at the Ames Center, at least from a strictly speaking financial perspective. Moving on to the golf course. So currently, the operating revenues cover the operating costs, but just barely, slightly. But they do not, much like the ice arena, generate enough of a revenue stream to support its ongoing capital needs. So this model currently assumes an annual fee increase of 4%. And it does include about $1 million in capital projects, but it doesn't include, again, much like the other funds, about $400,000 supported by the Facilities Capital Project Fund. Really, at this point in time, the city, from a financial perspective, would either need to increase the fees in order to support the operation and build additional revenues for capital. It may, like other communities do, opt to treat it like a traditional park unit and subsidize it with the property tax levy, much like you would just open space or a playground that doesn't generate revenue. Or like you see in the case of the Ames Center and the ice arena, you could assign more or all of its capital projects to the Facilities Capital Project Fund, which would help reduce the overall negative fund balance that you see in 2034. It would still be slightly negative in those years, but it would be much closer to zero, but still well below its fund balance requirement. From, I think, our perspective, it's likely that if the city wanted to address the funding issue, especially in the out years, it would probably require a combination of these approaches.
Dan, would the franchise fee we're talking about, would that include being able to do something like that?
Mayor, members of the council, the franchise fee can really be used for any applicable city cost. In this scenario, what I would imagine happening is the city council would reassign the capital projects that are currently supported by the fund to the Facilities Capital Project Fund. So much like you're doing now, you would just do more of it. Moving into the EDA fund, as you can see, based on the council's decision in the last year to increase the property tax levy, we are currently assuming by the end of 2034, the EDA would have about $18.5 million in fund balances to support economic development activities. We are planning at this point in time for that property tax levy to increase by $250,000 in 2025 and then remain at the statutory maximum thereafter. As a result of that, it will begin contributing more than $1 million to fund balance annually by 2025 and $1.5 million annually by 2028. It's worth noting that the fund currently supports an operating budget of about $532,000, and this model does not include any additional program or capital costs related to EDA activities. So, of course, if you were to expand existing programs, like some of the loan programs, or to establish new ones, or to acquire a property or something to that effect, of course, this long-term projection would change. But right now, there really aren't any new program costs, and there aren't any new projects that at least haven't risen to the level to be included in the financial plan. So right now, the city and the EDA are just building a position to allow it to have more self-determination related to its own economic development activities. So lastly here, kind of going over all of the funds, this is the potential bonding. We've touched on them in individual funds, and I do apologize, it's a little small to see, but we are trying to put 10 years onto one slide. Essentially, what you can see is that there's relatively modest bonding for the more typical projects over the 10 years. And in fact, the Improvement Construction Fund bonding, that's the special assessment portion of your street projects. So that's something that the city has been doing for some time now. It doesn't affect your statutory debt limit in any way. You can see that mainly there's all this bonding, there's about $210 million that's currently programmed for facilities improvements, again, for Police City Hall, Fire Station number 2, and the maintenance facility. And then we do have currently in the Equipment and Vehicle Fund, 1 set of equipment certificates in 2026, again, primarily for the fire rescue that's programmed for that year. The other thing that I would add is that this does not include any bonding that would be related to the utility funds. Those aren't included in the FMP. So there are additional bonds that are traditionally issued by the city every year related to the utility portion of your street projects. And then kind of ending where we began, just a reminder, this is the impact on the median valued home. We went through all of those individual funds, the general fund, the capital project funds. A lot of them are supported by the property tax levy. So once again, we see a smaller increase in 25 related to those changes in the residential homestead exclusion. And then moving into 26 and 27, around $100 to $135 a year, and then an average of about $90 in those out years based on the current projections and modeling that's been performed to date. So ultimately, it's kind of like we talked about in the beginning, the FMP update really is designed to respond to the strategic direction as we understand at this point in time from the City Council and the needs of the Burnsville community. Some of the issues that we've identified may take years to address, and I think that was borne out in some of the charts where it does take quite some time to either build reserves or build back reserves or to adjust the financial position of a particular operation or fund. Much of the impact occurs in 25 through 27. That's primarily related to, as the bullet point lower on the slide says, the non-binding property tax levy changes and the impacts it has on the general fund balance. But those needs are balancing out well with the strategic priorities of the council because, as I mentioned at the beginning, even with those non-binding commitments, the council and the community, especially on the general fund, still remain within that 40 to 50% window required by policy. There is limited property tax supported debt for capital projects, so there was an eye to make sure that we were reducing the impact on the property taxpayer. And then, like always, and as you've seen in individual funds, there will always be a need to monitor those various balances to make sure that the city remains compliant with those various fund balance requirements, or that if you do dip below them, that you have a plan to build back from them to make sure that you're not put in a reactionary position financially with some of those funds. And in case you're wondering, these are the most popular TV shows in every state. And I knew you were.
Today?
Okay. Any questions for Dan? Well, this is good. At least we have the information with regard to the FMP for the next 10 years. And so when we dive into the budget as we continue to move along, we have a good foundation to start from. And we understand. And so we'll also get the auditor's report in June.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so we'll have all of our information in terms of looking at our budget for the next 5 years. Okay. Any thoughts, questions?
We need to make a reboot of Married with Children.
Oh, I didn't notice Mary.
Yeah, these are the most popular TV shows in every state.
This list was
So,
wild.
as it's Mary Tyler
We had a
Moore.
dynamic conversation about this slide as the leadership team
Right.
earlier today.
This is really the most important thing that we're talking about.
It proves you right, Dan, unfortunately.
Family Guy zone.
No reason this can't be fun.
Well, Dan, thank you so
Where's
much, and
Yellowstone?
thank you for coming and presenting
having
this,
me,
and
Madam
thank
Mayor.
you for all of your work. And Jenny and Alyssa, thank you. I mean, you two have been working with Dan on all of this, and so thank you for all of that, and Greg, for your leadership as we continue to move along and ensure that we continue to provide the services that our residents and businesses expect of us, and we'll continue to do excellent work, because that's what they expect us to deliver. So, thank you very much.
Nice job.
And with that, if there's nothing else, we stand adjourned by acclamation.